Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Secret Origins of Mint Condition. This episode is part of our Halloween-themed episodes for October. Joining me is, of course, Joe.
Hello, folks.
And Chris.
Hey, y'all.
And also joining us as we make our way through this episode, which I'll get to in a moment, is a friend of the show, returning guest, and a co-host of the Star Trek edition of this podcast. John is with us.
Hey, everyone.
And also joining us is friend of the show, returning guest, and our academic, Professor Jack Adrian is with us.
Hello, everyone. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, everyone. And so with this episode today, we are going to dive into the classic TV show, The Twilight Zone, which I've seen them all, but I have, it's hard to remember all of them. But Joe and Jack have a deep, deep passion, I would say, for them. So we're going to just talk about it in general terms, bring up some highlights. And so Joe, before our mics went on, you posed the question as to why this brand, this show was such in the popular zeitgeist that every year at New Year's or 4th of July, we would have a marathon of these shows. So why do you think The Twilight Zone has stood the test of time?
Well, I think it stood the test of time because it was a well-produced show, beautifully written, scripted, acted, directed. I mean, Rod Serling was just a genius. And I think people recognize the craftsmanship. But it transcends that because it's just part of American culture. I mean, the very first episode, where is everybody? The one with Earl Holliman? He's in the town. He's the only guy in that strange, empty town. That's such a great way to kick off a show like this. Where is everybody? Because when you think about it, it was 1959, I believe, when the show premiered, right? So we're coming out of it's still the Eisenhower years, and still the whole Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harry generation. And here's something that comes along and just turns things off kilter more than slightly. And I think it just grabs people. It grabs their imagination because it's what the show's about, imagination. And I think that's why it's so popular until this day. It's imagination run amok. And I think that speaks to everybody. So that's what I think, why it's so popular.
No, I agree with you. I mean, it's definitely, again, like we've spoken about in other episodes, similar, like we've been talking about recently about The Sandman, just because it's out, how Neil Gaiman created this vehicle where he could tell any story, and The Twilight Zone is of a similar ilk, where, Rod Serling created this format where you could basically do any type of storytelling at all and get away with it because of what the format allows you to do. John, what are your thoughts on The Twilight Zone?
So it was always part of the culture for me growing up, but I think as someone's mentioned even before we started, I got my first taste of it through all the marathons that would happen on different holidays. And I never understood why that was a show that was chosen for marathons. It was always that, it seemed, or The Honeymooners for me, that was on, but both shows in the 1950s. And a lot of the episodes really stood out to me with really out there stories. It was scary as a kid, but also interesting. It's also where I got my first intro to William Shatner. I think I saw him in that before Star Trek, if I remember correctly.
Really? That's interesting. Wow.
And that episode freaked me out. The idea of having this monster on the plane,
Sure, yeah.
wing, and I looked out the window of every plane I was in. I'd be like, wait a second, and particularly at night. I didn't realize until later, really, what the that it wasn't about the paranormal or the incident itself. It was about the human reaction and the human condition, because that episode, which always stood out to me, was really about the idea of seeing something and nobody believing you. And that's the real terror. So the show was like, we're going to give you the scary thing, and then we're going to actually get to where the real terror is, which is psychological or social or human. And it was almost, I think of it as sort of subversive in that way. And my, if I'm recalling correctly, some stuff about Rod Serling is that he was really a master at getting things through. Joe, as you said, like this show, where did it come from in the 1950s, 1959? Like, where do you get, going from the really family-friendly fare that was very, very watered down of any controversy to this? And I imagine him much like I imagine some modern TV producers who get stuff through, and everybody goes like, how did they do that? And I think he opened up television to an entirely new type of storytelling that has had an effect now. I mean, I think of that as we've discussed in Babylon 5, JMS started the idea in many ways of of a long term story, but he had to trick the networks. Basically, had to sort of like give bait and switch. Here's what I'm going to give you, and then actually do something else. And I always had the feeling this had something along those lines that it was presented in one way, and he managed to really subversively get it to be much more compelling, but darker. And the commentary. This is the age of the House Committee on Un-American Affairs, Joe McCarthy. Out there to have a show that had very clear sentiments against that kind of mindset, but doing it through science fiction. That's a type of subversion I think that you get sort of through a genius writer like Rod Serling.
Yeah, John. That was great. I should just pick up because of a book we haven't mentioned in a while, and still have to do an episode on it. Becoming Superman by JMS. I think JMS recants a story where
we totally do.
One of his first people to read his work happened to be Rod Serling. He was, I think, at a writers' convention at a college, and someone picked up, like, he didn't even know who the person was. They just picked up one of his stories, read through it, and said it was pretty good. And then someone came and was, you know who that is? He's like, who is? That's Rod Serling. He's like, oh my God.
No, you're totally right. You remember that correctly.
So he definitely, JMS and Babylon 5 is definitely influenced by the work of Rod Serling and obviously the Twilight Zone. Chris, what are your thoughts about the Twilight Zone?
No, John, I really appreciate your insight. I think you put it, you put it better than I could. You articulated it well. My experience was with the Twilight Zone was absolutely through those 4th of July and New Year's Eve marathons that they'd have. It was you're right, that and Honeymooners, and then sometimes it would be Star Trek, the original series. But I liked watching it. I really, really enjoyed the hell out of watching Twilight Zone, because it didn't matter where I came in. I didn't need to catch up, right? Because it was always different characters. It was these different stories. I didn't need to know. It was fun because growing up, I watched it with my parents, and more my dad than my mom. But they would point out different celebrities that were on the show. And that was always sort of like interesting to me, because I wasn't used to that. You see the same characters, at least when I was watching television, you saw the same characters. It was telling different stories with the same characters, and Twilight Zone didn't do that. So you had all these cool stars who came in, people like Art Carney and, Shatner, like they came in and they did these one-offs, and that was super cool. But another thing that I find really interesting, besides the fact that like some of these episodes really stick with me, a lot of them don't. Not because they weren't good or whatever, they just didn't resonate with me, and I haven't been back to revisit. But one of the things that I always kind of think is super cool is that people have different points of reference for the series, and it's not like there's a bad season. Some of the most memorable episodes come from all over the course of the 5 seasons. And that's, I think, really unusual for a TV show. Usually there's a season that isn't that good or not that memorable. Sometimes people remember the first couple of seasons, but then it drops off, or the later seasons before the show found its stride. But even so far in this episode, some of the episodes that we've mentioned have been in the first season and the last season. So there's something about it that's kind of magical, that you can tell these different stories that are unsettling in so many different ways. And the one thing that really unites them is that, for the most part, it's the mundane turned, if not deeply unsettling, and somewhat upsetting. And humans, and this comes up in a multitude of episodes where, like, aliens talk about it in a couple of episodes. It's so easy to unsettle humans and get us to indulge our basest instincts. That's one of the scariest things about the show. So I really enjoy it. I really admire it as somebody who is like a big fan of, I guess, the show without being such a fan that I really know the show, if that makes any sense.
No, it left an impression with you. I mean, he's doing what good sci-fi does, and it's showing a mirror to us, not directly. Maybe sometimes directly with some of those episodes, it's showing a mirror to us. But
yeah, totally.
But as John was saying, it's like subversive. Also, it's getting to us, and it's getting the heart of real things that affect everyday life without, like, sometimes it's making you feel unsettled by digging it in
Absolutely.
In this very sly sort of way. Jack, what are your thoughts on the show?
Thank you, James. No, so I think like everyone else, I think the show as it exists is kind of become part of like the American consciousness, and so I think it holds a place right up there with Star Trek. Holds a place right up there with I Love Lucy. It's one of those kind of seminal works that everyone can reference, and by extension, have some kind of experience or memory of their favorite episode, one that kind of was very thought provoking, one that was, on some level very scary and still lasts with them. But I think to John's point, it came at such a very interesting time, particularly in the 1950s with the Red Scare and Joseph McCarthy, and what that it's. And I think in our science fiction episode, we discussed science fiction in and of itself. In this case, it's science fiction and some fantasy. Is a more of a reflection of the current times than what it is they're trying to portray. And so I think that it did that very well. But also, I think additionally, one of the things that I think the show draws upon and what's been institutional to its lasting legacy is it comes from an earlier tradition of radio drama. And so it's building on this whole notion that families would sit around the radio and listen to radio plays. And again, the most famous of which is Orson Welles' The War of the Worlds, which he did in 1938. But it's also worth noting that there are a lot of American playwrights and screenwriters and novelists who got their start in radio drama, including Rod Serling and Irwin Shaw. And so, again, they would later go on to have such a huge impact on television because most of they essentially cut their chops on how do you convey a very quick and very clear theme in a very short amount of time to your audience that resonates. And so I think in many extents, to a great extent, that still endures with us today. I was also a fan of the show. Was actually every few years they will try to reimagine the show. And so there was a Twilight Zone that ran from 1985 to 89. I had watched those when they had aired originally. I owned those DVDs and I watched them, and so I think every generation is trying to tap in to the strength of what the original Twilight Zone did. I think the only current analog that we have would be something like Black Mirror. But again, I think that also captures that very same anthology, science fiction, fantasy reflection of our current time. And I think for those of our listeners who haven't seen it, that would definitely be something to kind of explore, to essentially understand in a current time setting what the impact of the Twilight Zone was then and what it still kind of means today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's had, like you said, its predecessor. I mean, we've had remakes of the Twilight Zone. I don't think any of them have hit as strongly as the original take on the Twilight Zone. I mean, I think there's some good episodes, and I have to admit, I'm not current on the reboots of the Twilight Zone that have happened over the years. You had, I guess, his counterpart, The Outer Limits, which I think was inspired by the Twilight Zone. I really don't know the history of like if they were competitors coming out at the same time, or if the Twilight Zone came out and then The Outer Limits came out to like compete with it, as television does. But yeah, like it's obviously and it's had its reflection and stuff in today's society, if not directly, then indirectly, in terms of how it affects all types of storytelling. I mean, it's probably a good place for us to maybe jump into favorite episodes or thoughts about some of our favorite episodes, because we've already talked about obviously the famous William Shatner episode with the monster on the plane. I'm going to forgive me, audience, because I don't have the episode list in front of me. So, Joe, what I guess what's one of your favorite episodes that you can remember?
Well, my favorite is Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, but I already referenced Where Is Everybody? The very first episode. Scary, it's still scary. It still scares me today. This whole concept of waking up and finding yourself alone someplace. Whether it be a small town in the middle of a big city, it's I don't know if trope is the right word to use here. We've seen it done numerous times in Hollywood in films and TV shows. The last man or the last woman on earth, so to speak. It's taken right out of a nightmare, and so that's one of my favorite episodes. And I'm trying. Oh, and I can't think of the name of the episode now. I wish I could, but of course the one with Burgess Meredith. Yes. He's down in the vault when the atomic attack happens, and of course all he wants to do is read, and he's apparently the last one alive, at least in the city, and he's stacking up all the books in the library on the library steps. And
thank you, Jack. Jack has mentioned it's time enough at last.
Thank you, Jack.
Episode 8.
Yeah, that's a great episode. And then, of course, he's going to spend the rest of his life reading, and he leans over and he busts his eyeglasses. And then, there was no lens crafters in those days. And if there was, it wouldn't have been around because of the atomic explosion. So those are some of the episodes that come to mind right away for me.
No, I mean those are I think timeless, and I think they're really well known. And again, you talk about also those stars that come in, do one episode and leave, and the great work they do. What about you, Jack? What are some of your favorite episodes?
So there are the ones that are my favorite episodes, and there are the ones that just scared the living hell out of me. And so the thing is, but you somewhat enjoy it, and so I know the episode The Hitchhiker, season 1, episode 16, and it's about this woman who is basically just driving across country, and she sees this man at every road stop, and so going through it. And so I think this kind of harkens back to what James says with respect to the Sandman. It's or maybe it was you, Chris, but it's one of those situations where you can tell any story that you want, and I'm not going to ruin the surprise for those of our audience who haven't seen it yet, but eventually you get a resolution as to why she keeps seeing this man and what it actually means. But I mean that's one of those episodes that just kind of just stays with you for so long. And The Eye of the Beholder, the episode.
That's absolutely one I was going to name. That's a great choice.
Well, poaching is just encouraged on the podcast. So
Yes.
But it was just the way it was filmed, because you're watching the episode and it's got these dark lightings and shadows, and you never see anyone's face until the big surprise reveal at the end. And one of these amazing things, and I think The Simpsons perhaps does it more frequently than others, but the parodies that are even made from the Twilight Zone episodes, where so many other shows are derivative of some of the kind of just the subtlety and the nuance of the filming and the scripts that it has so much become part of just. I think people will see things and they won't even know that it has its antecedents in a Twilight Zone episode. But another one, and this one is just not as popular, is
Hold on, I'm sorry, Jack.
No,
Can I interrupt you real
course.
quick? Because I'm curious, because this is a thing. So hold that thought. But now I sort of want to flip over to John for a quick second and ask you, John, because, Jack, you just mentioned the parodies and how widely they're done and how it's such a part of the zeitgeist. Sometimes we don't even realize this. So, John, you and I were talking off air a little bit about how we don't know the show thoroughly. We are somewhat familiar. We remember some episodes. But has it been your experience? How has it been your experience with regards to, because you're so in touch with so much of the pop culture zeitgeist? How much overlap have you seen? Is it a thing that you've recognized, appreciated? Is it something that sort of passes you by? What's your experience been with that? Just sort of as a quick aside, because you mentioned it, Jack, and I want to jump on it.
Especially in terms of the way that this shaped pop culture or overlapped it, I would say that it's probably influenced the way that most every show with a tinge of fantasy or sci-fi or alternative storytelling goes. And weirdly enough, the show that just popped into mind, and I don't even know why, because they're not similar, but for some reason The Good Place just popped into my head, because it was a show that was profoundly about exploring the human condition and literally outright saying we're basically exploring the philosophy of moral ramifications of existence and all kinds of things related to that. And it was also incredibly silly and funny and poignant. And again, that goes back to what I feel is that word subversive. It's subversive in that it's subverting your expectations. You think you're getting one thing, and then you walk away, and it's actually like a meal where you got more nutrition than you realized, but you thought it was all junk food. That's very much, and I feel like that way of slipping it in really was profound in the episodes that I've seen in Twilight Zone. I've probably seen about a third of the entire episodes. I think they're about 150, give or take. And it just has this feeling of you think you're going one way, you think it's going to be maybe a little bit scary or surreal or intense just about the character. There was one episode about a gunslinger, if I remember.
Yep.
And
season 2, I believe.
Yeah, and it's about, okay, he's regretting all his decisions in his life, but he has a chance to basically, be the best. Fate gives him the chance to be the fastest gunslinger in the world. The irony is, Fate is also given that same opportunity through a potion to the other person.
Yeah.
And the consequence is they both learn a very tough lesson about life and what the purpose is. And so I won't tell you exactly what happens with them, but they walk away with a much more profound understanding of life. And that's not what you get from a lot of just sort of regular entertainment where it's just sci-fi for the sake of cool. Let's see what we can do. Let's see what we can show you. And you mentioned Black Mirror. Black Mirror is definitely in the same wavelength. I think Black Mirror gives me the sense of like they're doing Twilight Zone super on the nose, like right on the nose. They're taking something that we're dealing with and then making sort of a very intense story about that and the consequences of technology right in that Twilight Zone. Set the standard. Let's get you there, but also make you think about it in more of a way. And between movies and a lot of sci-fi shows, I feel like even shows like Star Trek take a lot of inspiration from that, because if you look at Star Trek, particularly original series, it's that same idea of like we're going to put it in a setting that's out of normal life completely, so we can experiment and do what we want to do. There's going to be a moral of the story, and it's going to be fundamentally about the human experience in that. And a lot of other shows at the time were really just about, again, entertainment, showing up, a sitcom. This is what it's like, maybe some fun stuff, but it was supposed to be very, very real, if comedic, and a lot of other comedy shows. I took that, but I think even comedy has taken a lot from the idea of Twilight Zone. I mean, hell, even Family Guy can take some elements of that where they're like, yeah, we're in this crazy animated world, but there's this sort of like poignancy to a lot of it that is just initially seemingly silly and crazy. And that's the interesting part about this. And I can't think of a TV show that did it before. And I'm having a hard time thinking about a TV show now that does it as intentionally.
No, that's great, John. I really am grateful for that insight. Thank you. And I want to throw it back to you. I know, Joe, you got your hand up, and then I want to go back to Jack for your next favorite episode too, because I wanted to get back to that list. I'm enjoying it, but thank you, John. That was that's sort of that's sort of what I've come to expect from you, is to be able to sort of pull all these disparate elements together, and articulate them in a way that really makes the connections very clear, sort of makes them glow so that the rest of us can see them. So thank you for that.
Oh, my pleasure. It's my crazy mind.
I just like to say, just follow up what John said about how comedy has taken some ideas from the Twilight Zone. I'm thinking of one in particular, the final episode of a very popular show in the 80s and 90s, the Newhart show. And I don't know if you guys are aware of the ending of that show. And here I'm going to, if you're a Newhart fan, let's leave right now. And I'm going to spoil the ending of Newhart. Newhart is a crazy show about this inn that's running this town in Vermont, and everybody around Bob Newhart or Bob Hartley seems to be, like right out of the Green Acres. They have no idea what's going on, and he's dealing with these crazy neighbors and people that work for him. The final episode, the final scene, Bob Newhart's in bed. We think he's in bed with Mary Fran, the actress who plays his wife, but he wakes up and he pushes, wake up. And it's not Mary Fran. It's Suzanne Plachette from the Bob Newhart show from 10 years earlier. And he goes, I just had this dream. I was running this inn with all these crazy characters. And, the two brothers with the same name, Larry, Daryl. It was just great. It was just a Twilight Zone epic moment for the end of a TV series. And another TV series that had a Twilight Zone type ending was St. Elsewhere. After 8 years, we find out that none of that happened. All that went on in St. Elsewhere happened in the mind of an autistic child.
Spoilers for St. Elsewhere.
Yeah, spoilers for St. Elsewhere, folks. So,
and the Bob Newhart show, but I wasn't too worried about that one.
Yeah, but so yes, comedy has taken a few notes out of the playbook of Twilight Zone, and I think it's infectious. And I think people who, showrunners and writers and directors who see great quality and want to be a part of that and want to inject it into their programs in some way or fashion.
I mean, Joe and Jack, we'll get back to you in 1 second. But Joe, I think you're also describing something that the Twilight Zone probably invented is the twist ending.
Yes,
You're talking
very
about
much so. Yeah.
the ending that doesn't you don't see it coming. It's a surprise to the audience, and I think that's one of the things. Rod Serling. I mean, I'm sure it was done in books, but for TV, for mass TV audience, I think he was the first one to come up with the twist ending. But Jack, back to your list.
Oh, thank you, James. So about the twist ending, and I think, again, bringing you back to pop culture, many people aren't aware of the fact that Rod Serling was helped draft the screenplay for the Planet of the Apes. And so, again, when you see, when we consider twist endings, I think it becomes very clear as to the impact he had, again, coming off the Twilight Zone, but also then essentially having perhaps the greatest twist ending of any film, that anyone can kind of recall. And so the ability for him to do that, not only in the show, but also in kind of the Planet of the Apes and all of the reiterations and all of the reboots that they tried, no one has ever truly been able to capture the impact of that twist ending. And so there's just one other episode that I wanted to mention, and this is one that it took me years to actually see. It was a season 4 episode, and it was one of the longer ones, and it's on Thursday we leave for home, and it's very subtle, and it's about an alien, the humans on a far distant planet, and they're in a colony, and they're just struggling, and so then someone comes to rescue them, and then all of the dynamics of the interrelationships between the people just kind of starts to kind of manifest itself, and it's just a very interesting, and I think John said this as well, it says so much about the human condition, and to some extent, I think, as John said, so much of the television we enjoy now, I think, stems from that. This whole notion of it's not enough just to kind of have a plot and characters to move through the plot. It's how do the characters change in the course of engaging with each other and engaging through the plot in which the writer, the screen writer places them in. And I don't necessarily know if we would have had this deep reservoir of good television over successive generations without the Twilight Zone showing you can do it, week by week, and you don't even need the same characters, coming in to carry the story forward.
That's a great point. I hadn't really thought about that, but I imagine that, and we've certainly heard that even now, it's a question that you'll hear from studios, and it's largely a bullshit question. But can this person, is this person high profile enough to carry our show? Not are they talented enough, but are they high profile enough to make sure that we keep getting ratings? And here you have somebody going, oh yeah, no, we were going to have all these stars. Oh no, they're only going to be in for one episode. We won't need them for the rest of the episodes. It's okay. We'll keep going. And I hadn't really thought about it from that angle before, but you're absolutely right. They have some of the best episodes they have are with quote nobodies when it comes to stars of stage and screen, and then other episodes feature big names that everybody knows. So that's really interesting.
So what are some of other people's favorite episodes?
I'll jump in. I'll jump in with.
Yeah, please do.
I've been trying to find the episode, and I think I found the title of it, which would be perfectly fit. And correct me if I'm wrong here. I think it's called Eye of the Beholder.
Yep.
It was the one basically about beauty standards.
Mm-hmm. I talked about it earlier. That's the one.
And that always stuck out because that was you have that that prosthetic which is pretty hideous looking.
Yes, it is.
And I'm like, oh god, that is so ugly. And everybody's reaction to somebody looking like a beautiful woman by our standards, generally speaking, was hideous. And for again, if you're a kid and you see that, you're like, wait a second. That's not how it is.
Yeah.
And it provokes a little bit of thinking there as to what the nature of that kind of thing might be. And I think that's at the base level always an important part of a show like that. But it so freaked me out as a kid that there would be a different standard. It's like, wait, I was confident in what I knew. I was confident in what I thought. The concept of beauty or aesthetics or anything was, and this is what we're told, this is what we are. So it's sort of nice to get an episode like that where it throws that on its head, and it definitely left a bit of an impact. in terms of that. I don't remember the full plot of the episode, except that it involved a botched plastic surgery that made them quote unquote ugly when we would have thought them beautiful.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, and that's sort of interesting too, because in and of itself, I mean, sometimes we just remember these moments. So, like, one of my favorite episodes is "Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up?" It's episode 28 from season 2, and the police have to figure out if a diner patron is actually a Martian invader. And man, it's. I remember as a kid just really enjoying the episode, and then there's a twist at the end in terms of like who is the alien and from where, that sort of thing. It's worth watching, but I will say this: it wasn't the twist that really makes me remember the episode, even though there's plenty of the episode that I don't remember. Much like you, John, there's plenty of the episode I don't remember. I don't remember it line for line. I remember the plot. I remember the idea behind it. I don't remember some of the exchanges, but I remember how it ends. But also, there's when somebody is uncovered, somebody who wasn't part of the conversation, kind of, so to speak, they just start laughing. And that laugh, when I was younger, really, that was the part of the episode that freaked me out. It was so malicious and it was so off-putting that I really liked that episode because it creeped me out. So it's interesting how there are these little moments that really stick with us. And for me, another one of my favorite episodes is The Masks. And I think that's season 5.
That's a great one, Chris. That's a great one.
Oh, this father insists that as part of, he's on his deathbed, and basically as part of he says to his kids, you'll only get your inheritance if you put these masks on, and they humor him, and without going into too many details, because I love the episode, I think you should go and watch it. There's this great lesson about the ugliness within and our ability to hide it, and what do we do when that ability is negated or compromised, so that everybody can see our ugliness. But they're wearing these masks through the episode, and I wasn't able to put a name to the concept before I got into theater and studied it in college. But when people do good mask work, the masks come alive. They really, like, even these masks that do not move. You can see the emotions in the faces of these masks. It's crazy to me that you can have a solid mask, and then if the actor is good at what they do, it seems as though the mask is emoting. Okay, it's expressing emotion, and that's something that I didn't understand when I was watching the episode, but it was something that I still appreciated, because I'm looking at it going like, it's unsettling how these masks seem to be emoting. So it's interesting to me, because that's some of the stuff that sticks with me. Some of the episodes that everybody else has named, I've already sort of jumped on and gone, oh yeah, great episode, that was good. Because there are so many good episodes for different reasons. Sometimes because they exposed something about humanity, sometimes because they were genuinely creepy. But those are the two that always stick with me, are The Masks and Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up?
Masks is especially creepy, Chris, to think about afterwards, just in the whole thing that happened with it.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's coming back to what the mask's emoting. There's this great moment at the end of the episode where they're just sitting in these masks, and you're like, wow. Yeah, I do. I love the ending to that episode.
Yeah, definitely. Joe,
I just did a little research and to see what big names were in the show. The aforementioned William Shatner, obviously, but some of these are quite the star cast here, with Cloris Leachman, George Takei. There's a story about that episode, by the way.
I totally forgot about Cloris Leachman.
Yeah.
Roddy McDowall, Robert Redford, Don Rickles, Jack Klugman, Elizabeth Montgomery, Peter Falk, Lee Marvin, Rod Taylor, Robert Duvall. And my favorite, because it's perfect. I mean, why wouldn't you have Kevin McCarthy look to the skies?
I thought it was going to be our journey, but yeah.
Yeah, right. So Kevin McCarthy from The Body Snatchers. So there was such great talent on this show, and I guess late 50s, early 60s, and a few years later we got something similar from a show that was completely the opposite spectrum of this show, and that was the Adam West Batman TV show that drew all these great Hollywood A-listers that wanted to be on that show. So people recognize quality, and they want to be a part of it. It's great. It's a great tradition that he started. So
one of my favorite episodes is The Invaders. It's the one where this old woman is I guess, tortured by this miniature flying saucer.
Oh, that's
And
right. Yes.
I
I forgot that one. Yeah.
these little action figure sized aliens come out and terrorize her. So that's a great one. And Jack, I think speaking to you, talking about Planet of the Apes, and Rod Serling worked on that. He also, like, I guess, started kind of the ideas for that with was it I Shot an Arrow at the Moon, where the astronauts think they've landed on an alien planet, and spoilers, but it turns out they were never left Earth at the end of that episode. Of course, Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, classic. I just remember that one so vividly because I think we had to read the short story when I was in elementary school. But that like really cuts to the depth and is still relevant today about human paranoia. And the aliens are subjecting us to an experiment to see how long it takes for us to break is a fantastic episode. And I'm trying. There's a bunch of other ones I like too, but I don't know the names of them. I can't remember the name of this other one, the one where the guy thinks he's in heaven, but and everything comes easy to him in terms of gambling and women and all the food he wants, and it drives him nuts to the point where he's like, I think I'm in the wrong place. Am I in the wrong place? He's like, no, you're in the right place. You think this is heaven, and it's revealed that he's actually in hell because this hell is getting everything you want and not ever overcome resistance, which I think is a great sort of idea and message for life in general. If you get everything you want, what kind of life is that? So
that's the point, exactly.
Yeah, and of course, many of the episodes all of you spoke about, I love dearly, and there's probably a bunch of them that I can't, even remember that are still great. I think for the Twilight Zone, just in general, we've spoken about some of this. I mean, aside from like we talked about the twist endings, we talked about the anthology nature of the show, groundbreaking. I think it also dived into the topic of us being afraid of technology as well. And I'm trying to remember, there's probably other social issues that we haven't touched upon that this show is groundbreaking for.
Well, I mean, there was a ton. There's another good episode, and I'm not going to remember the name, so maybe somebody can help me out here. But basically, I think it's that the power goes out on a street, and the longer the power is out, the more people start panicking and sort of accusing each other. And at some point, it's basically a lynching that happens, and it's because the power went out. That's
the Monsters Are Due on Maple Street.
Oh, yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, talking about, here it is. You have a lynching that happens, right? Like, there were a lot of social issues that were discussed. So, going back to what John and Jack were saying earlier about it being subversive, it was absolutely that, and there were all sorts of issues, and some of it allowed you to sort of take what you would from it. I think looking back now, I will say that I think if I go back eventually and watch these episodes, I'm going to be able to go, yeah, that's a little more heavy-handed than I remember. But certainly for the time, not necessarily quite so heavy-handed. And again, storytelling can evolve. It's one of the reasons I've wanted to get to Jordan Peele's Twilight Zone, and I just haven't gotten to it.
I think you nail it with what you're saying about how, does it feel heavy-handed? Is it not? What are they trying to do? And when you look at it in the context of 1950 to the early 60s, there was still a pretty big tightrope to balance there in terms of getting past the network executives and genuine censors at that.
Right.
And I really think of what they were able to do with the episodes, primarily where it was about showing human nature when under stress and the worst of human nature coming out. Though I think that the show always gave a little bit of hope as well. That not everybody is there condemned by that fate. But that, like with the lynching episode, with the other ones where it was just like, wait, you take people out of their comfort zone, you put them in the Twilight Zone, an unknown place, something where fear dominates, and it might bring out the worst in human nature. That as a through line of the Twilight Zone allowed them to really, get those stories out in ways that would make people question. I think question where they had been. Having come through. Actually, I realized McCarthy era probably ended shortly before this. To correct my earlier statement, but to get through that. And also not seem quite as, I don't know, the show didn't come off as rebellious like the nature of the early to mid 60s, was beginning to be. It was subversive, which is very different. It wasn't just trying to say, hey, we don't believe in this. It was like saying, no, let's take a deep dive in this and find out what's really going on.
Yeah, absolutely, John.
One of the things that I always appreciate about the show were the opening and the closing narration. I just found that they were so haunting, in so that you would kind of open and just kind of give you a little preview of what the episode was going to be about, and then also the closing narration just kind of gave you something to ponder as the episode closed, and I think that's just obviously in many ways Twilight Zone is morality play, and but just to have that kind of spelled out after watching it by Rod Serling, I think also provided just a very good kind of point at the end of what you had just seen, and so bringing it back to I think again, as we've discussed Black Mirror, it does really just kind of resonate, and I think the reason why some of the favorite episodes are considered favorites, I think the ones we've listed, but also just by the viewership at large, is a lot of the opening and closing narrations that are provided on the show, because they I think were very well encapsulates exactly what the morality of the episode was. And I just want to give again, just for those who don't know, I did want to give like a shout out for the 1985 TV series. There were some really good episodes. Again, by the end, they perhaps the quality perhaps kind of deteriorated, but some of the episodes were directed by Wes Craven. Some of the teleplays were by Harlan Ellison. So I mean, there were just some really good episodes. I
had sort of forgotten about that Harlan Ellison had worked on that, which of course also comes up in Becoming Superman. And Wes Craven, I'd forgotten too. No, that's great, Jack. I'm glad you mentioned that.
And I think the '80s show also had a sequel with Bill Mummy to his original episode too. I vaguely remember.
Yes.
So, the classic Bill Mummy episode. Yeah.
So if anyone ever has and again, I had watched it in its original run, and so then I actually went out and I purchased all the DVDs. Remember those to actually enjoy them, and so I didn't say Laserdisc, and so then exactly or reel to reel, and so it really is. It gives you a definite sign into the times, and so. Most of Twilight Zones are very reflective of the times in which they're created. And so you really get a very good look at the 80s and what the concerns were. I mean, so obviously nuclear proliferation, conspicuous consumption. I mean, so there's just a lot of good kind of episodes that kind of focus on the concerns then. And you get to see it as it was imagined by the writers at that time. So again, highly unlikely anyone's going to just kind of stumble upon them. I don't think it's airing anywhere. Maybe, I'm not sure if Paramount Plus carries them or someone else may. But if you ever have an opportunity, it's definitely worth. Most of them are worth your time to check out.
Yeah, I mean, as we wrap up this episode, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Twilight Zone the movie. I personally think it was great. Dan Aykroyd, John Lithgow. Oh, who am I forgetting? Also. In the Scatman Crothers is in it. I mean, it's great. I mean, I personally great. I mean, it is just a reinterpretation of classic episodes, but I think Twilight Zone the movie is fantastic to watch. And John Lithgow as the William Shatner role, I think he's was brilliant in that too. So as we wrap this up, do we have any final thoughts on the Twilight Zone? I open up to all of you to give any final impressions or thoughts or things we have not covered so far in this episode.
Well, there's one thing. So as we indicated, Black Mirror, I think, is kind of like the emotional kind of heir to the Twilight Zone. Another Netflix show, Love, Death, and Robots, also kind of has that very same kind of anthology series. It's animated, various different kind of animation styles, but essentially they are kind of trying to tell very concise story using the vignettes, trying to kind of get to a morality. So if you've had a chance to watch them, they're not all great, but most of them are very interesting and entertaining.
No, it's great, Jack. You had told me about Love, Death, and Robots. I still haven't gotten to it yet, but it's on my list. Joe, you had some final thoughts.
Well, yeah, just to me, obviously, if it's the 1950s, early 60s, and you have this groundbreaking, for lack of a better word, avant-garde type of TV show, and you want to get it past the censors and the suits, just wrap it in allegory and metaphor.
Yes. Well, it worked for Star Trek, right?
Yeah, so,
Yeah. Great. Do we, before we, I guess, officially wrap up, I think we have time for quick recommendations. John and Jack, I know we didn't prep you for this, but we're open for anything you're watching, reading, or just hearing about what you're watching or reading, even if you don't recommend it. But Jack, I'll turn it over to you. Have any audience recommendations for
Yes,
today?
absolutely. For All Mankind on Apple TV Plus, I essentially just binge watched all 4 seasons. The last season just wrapped up, I think, about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Season 4, they have been renewed, I think, for season 5. Really quick synopsis: it's alternative history where the Russians landed on the moon before the Americans, and so essentially that kept the space race going. And so by the time they hit the 80s and the 90s, they are already making plans to go to Mars. And so how our understanding of our place in the universe would have changed if we would have kept NASA funding the way it was at the same levels during the Cold War.
That's fine. I've heard nothing but good things about that show, so I'm looking forward to watching it. John, you have any recommendations for this week?
For this week, it's funny. I mean, obviously, like everyone, I imagine in our circle, it has to be Sandman, just to put that out there.
Yep.
It's one of the best produced shows in terms of a genuine, interesting, fascinating show. Different pacing than I think some people will be used to, because it's following very closely to the graphic novel, and something that was that Neil Gaiman thought was unfilmable. And one of the big takeaways I have from first, like, the show just being made, is that when you have a good author who also has shown a deft mastery of social media, like Neil Gaiman has, particularly in handling the trolls, there's a good chance that when they're given a lot of creative control and directly involved in the production process, that you're going to have something that comes pretty close to the amazing quality of the original. And Game of Thrones is an example of that, with its first 5 seasons, where the author was George Martin was heavily involved, and there was source material. I think there's so much cool stuff out there. So I'm going to plug something that hasn't come out yet, and that I am cautiously keeping my eye on the new Lord of the Rings show. It's going to come out on Amazon Prime, the Rings of Power. And I've heard some initial good reviews of it, but that there are a lot of people involved in the production who are trying to be very close to the original source material, and that's something that I think is very, very, very important. Second show, I'm going to go back. It's not that I'm watching it right now, but I mentioned it in tandem with this show, and it just brought up to my mind. I think anybody who is interested in good comedy, but also good human, philosophical discussions, watch The Good Place.
Yes.
It's so much
very good.
fun.
Yes.
And talk about some fun twists in the show.
Every season they do such a good job of writing themselves out of a corner they wrote themselves into.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with you, John. Those twists are incredible.
And again, like you talk about, like a cast of actors who make their way into it, really good. And my quick last third show, The Orville on Hulu. Their new season has been really, really good. And both those last shows do feature cameos by Ted Danson, or starring Ted Danson. So there you go.
Very nice, John. And I just started watching The Orville, so I'm on board with that recommendation as well. Chris, any recommendations for this week?
Sure. So let's see. I recently went back and I went and saw the Thor movie Love and Thunder. I was not a fan, but that's because I'm such a big fan. Mainly, it was because I was such a big fan of Gore the God Butcher in the Thor books, and so I recently went back and reread Gore the God Butcher, and it's just as good, if not better, than I remember it being. So if you haven't read the book, go back and read the books. They're on Hoopla, so you can find them there. I did read book 1 of Preacher. I don't say I'll recommend it. It's interesting, but it's not for me. It's very heavy-handed. There are some tropes in there that, I find not particularly creative. So I don't know how to enjoy Preacher, I think is what it comes down to. I won't say it's bad. I'll just say I don't know how to enjoy it. What I'm watching right now, reading also. I am currently reading, or I finished reading, and I don't know, Joe, if you got your copy yet, so I'm just going to spoil it. Rethinking Fandom, How to Beat the Sports Industrial Complex at Its Own Game by Craig Calcaterra. I've been listening to, or I've been reading he's got like a weekly newsletter. Well, it's a daily newsletter, but I do the free one because I'm cheap. And so that's on Thursdays. And so I read about what's going on in baseball. I think he's got a great, cannot recommend this book enough. Again, rethinking fandom, just sort of thinking about how do we consume sports, and how do we sort of reconcile some of the difficulties that we see in supporting the sports industrial complex that doesn't, that just wants our money and will happily throw us under the bus to get it, especially as evidenced with the legalization of gambling, and how very, very quickly all the leagues jumped into bed with professional gambling sites. So that's a really good read. And then watching wise at this point, I don't really think I have anything. I just finished Sandman, and I was watching a couple of things on assignment for this podcast that I'm not going to divulge just yet because I don't want to spoil anything. But yeah, I think that's what I'm doing right now is mostly reading.
No, it's fantastic, Chris. Those are great picks. And I have to agree with you. I have read all of Preacher, and I read it just because everyone talks about Preacher, but I don't necessarily say I enjoyed Preacher, but I am trying to, as we do sometimes, think about the art's place in the industry and the world. So I agree with you. Joe, what do you have for this week?
Well, I'm looking at my calendar, and I notice I have something circled for next Friday. Cobra Kai, Season 5 debuts. So I would highly recommend Cobra Kai to anyone who hasn't watched it yet. It's great. As I said, it's check your brain at the door. Lots of fun. So it's not the Twilight Zone, but it's still entertaining. And what am I reading now? Let's see. Oh, I just started rereading Jeff Johns's run on The Flash, Wally West. And he picked up right after Mr. Wade left. And it's interesting because Wade did so much more with the character, building up Wally's personality, and then Johns comes along and he maintains that and he adds to it, but he goes in a different direction, and he really starts bringing in the villains, and he does all these villain profiles, and we get to know the villains really, really well, and their motivations, their backgrounds, and it just fits so well into the whole framework of the book. So I would highly recommend Jeff Johns' run on The Flash. Those are my two recommendations.
Fantastic, Joe. My recommendations for the week is I've been reading the new volume of Swamp Thing. We have a new Swamp Thing. It's no longer Alec Holland. It's written by Ram V, and it's very...
Okay, I'll have to pick that up.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. I'm terrible. But the new Swamp Thing's avatar's name I am forgetting right now. But so it's Levi Kami. He is from India. He's the new avatar of the Green, and the first two volumes are kind of dealing with how he became Swamp Thing and him dealing with socio-economic political issues as the Swamp Thing, and it's very interesting because also he is Swamp Thing, but he's not dead, and he doesn't always have to be in Swamp Thing form. So it's a very different take on the character, which I'm enjoying. Like I've said many times in the podcast, give me something new because that's always enjoyable to watch. We've already talked about it, but I'm going to give a different spin and a different part of Hoopla. I rented out from Hoopla the Sandman Season 1 soundtrack to the Netflix series. This is done by David Buckley, and it's a fantastic soundtrack. I feel like the soundtrack, as much as we talked about the show, and we will talk about the show, I feel the soundtrack to the show in every episode was amazing. So I recommend taking that out and listening to it. And in terms of something to watch that I just finished watching Star Trek Prodigy. And I recommend it if you've been enjoying the new Star Trek that's been coming out. It has some great ideas, some great characters. It continues on with some classic Trek ideas and has some nice tributes in it. So definitely check out Star Trek Prodigy if you're looking for something new in the Star Trek universe to look at. And with that, I would like to say thank you to the listening audience, but most especially thank you to everyone who is a part of this episode. So thank you to Jack, thank you to John, and of course, thank you to Joe and Chris for making this episode possible. And listening audience, if you're interested in leaving your thoughts and comments on the Twilight Zone, please feel free to post when this episode drops on the Facebook page. You can also email us directly at secretoriginsmc@gmail.com. secretoriginsmc is our Instagram. And if you have the time, we'd really appreciate you liking this podcast and even giving it a review. It really helps us out and helps spread the word of the Secret Origins of Mint Condition. I thank you for listening, and I will talk to you on the next episode.